today, this morning. Thanks for taking. I'll just go right ahead and introduce our speakers for today, starting with Margarida Silva, who's a researcher and campaigner at Corporate Europe Observatory, which is a Brussels-based lobby watchdog, where she is tracking big tech's lobby power closely and for quite some time, and is also campaigning for stricter lobby regulations. Her last study on this issue of big tech's lobby power and influence just came out a month ago, I think, called The Lobby Network, Big Tech's Web of Influence in Europe. And for this study, Corporate Europe Observatory had teamed up with a German NGO called Lobby Control, and together they conducted an extensive research on what is big tech lobbying for, also in terms of spending, in terms of strategies and different narratives. And to basically show us what big tech is, how big the big tech lobby power is. And I think Margarida will talk more about that shortly. So first of all, thanks for being here today, Margarida. And our panelist then will be Andreas Vou, who is a data journalist with VoxEurop and the European Data Journalism Network. He has also covered big tech's lobby power and its influence on political processes, electoral processes, as well as on media's independence. And today, Andreas will kind of bring this topic of a rather abstract or maybe far away issue of lobbying to a very concrete example of the rise of surveillance technology across Europe, especially amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So about how big tech actually profited in this pandemic and has turned the tables in the political decision-making process, and ultimately what that means for civil society. So thank you so much for being here as well, Andreas. And last but certainly not least is Alexander Fanta, who will speak to us. He is a journalist and EU correspondent for the German digital rights news website netzpolitik.org. And there, of course, he has also been investigating and reporting on big tech's lobby influence and lobby actions, as well as digital policies of the European Union. Year then, he published a study with a colleague of his from Netzpolitik, where they scrutinized very closely the funding of Google towards media corporations, editorials, and journalists. So Alexander will talk to us more about two pillars of big tech lobbyism. That is the strategy of funding academia and academic research, as well as funding media corporations and ultimately journalists themselves in a way. And I think by that, thank you again as well to you, Alexander, for taking the time this morning. And I think it's quite apparent that there's a lot to big tech lobbying and a lot of aspects within this web of influence that we want to cover today. We'll try to get through it all. All audience, feel free to ask your questions in the point. I will either then later on, when we enter after the presentations, when we enter the discussion round, I will either read them out loud, or also indicate if you would like to speak to the panelists in person and direct your questions personally at them. Then you could also unmute and do so. So either way will work. And for the next hour, we'll try to get through the web of influence as much as possible. So I think without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Margarida.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the really nice introduction, Sarah and Trina. So today I would like to talk to you about this report that we've launched in August. I had not realized that it had only been 1 month since we launched. But let me just upload it very quickly. There, you should be seeing my presentation, right? Yeah. So in this report, we wanted to look at the overall state of tech lobbying and especially tech corporate lobbying in EU. We wanted to do this because in the past few years we'd seen how tech companies had taken the forefront in terms of lobbying, and at EU level, Google and Facebook constantly appeared as some of the biggest lobby spenders. And not only that, but also tech policy issues increasingly became bigger and bigger and more debated. So we wanted to take a little bit of a step back and take a more holistic approach to how we identified or described the tech lobby sector. What we did, we spent some time trying to identify the companies and the business associations and other lobby groups that would be active in digital policy and that were also active in digital economy. What we found was quite a varied universe of actors, over 612 actors that we could qualify like this, from a very diverse range of companies or business sectors. Of course, you had your typical internet companies like platforms or social media companies. You had the more the older ICT companies, telecoms companies, but you also had companies that were traditionally from another sector, but that had increasingly become more and more digitized, and then were also becoming important lobbyists. So here, think, for instance, of defense companies that are increasingly entering the cybersecurity or cyber surveillance fields. So together, these 612 companies, they spend about 97 million euros lobbying the EU annually. That's quite high. But even more interesting maybe than this is that in spite of the fact that you have 612 actors, this is actually quite an unbalanced universe. If we look specifically at the main, the top spenders of tech sector, and here really concentrating on ICT and platform companies, we can see that 10 companies, the lobby spending of 10 companies account for pretty much a third of the entire lobby spending. So Google, Facebook, the traditional GAFAM plus a few ICT, Huawei, IBM, together they spend about 32 million euros lobbying the EU. This makes it not only just that these companies have quite high budgets in themselves, but these are actually this makes that these companies are the highest lobby spenders in general. So if we compare the top 10 of internet companies or tech companies to the top 10 finance companies, extractive companies, or pharmaceuticals, these ones are actually spending a lot more lobbying the EU. Of course, with this comes benefits to them. Of course, they are spending money because they are trying to get something out of it. And what we've seen is that the deep lobby budgets of big tech allow them quite a leg up when it comes to ensuring that they get their voices heard in Brussels. We see this particularly when it comes to having access to lobby meetings, and especially with the European Commission, high levels of the European Commission. We looked at two different policy discussions that are happening right now, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And we looked at who was getting meetings with the high levels of the Commission, and found that 75% of all meetings had been with corporate interests, and that there really Google and Facebook led the number of meetings. A few notes here, though, is that we have quite a few limitations when it comes to access to data. So I keep referring to Commission high levels because that's the data that we actually have access to. The majority of Commission officials don't have to disclose their meetings. And that will include, for instance, the people actually writing the proposals, so quite important, quite heavily targeted part of the process. Even maybe more important are the other institutions, European institutions. So the Commission, of course, is heavily lobbied because it's the one that initiates the process, but then Parliament and Council also get lobbied intensely. Here I would really highlight the role of the Council. Council is where member states come together to define their positions and amend the proposals from the Commission. And this is often referred to as the black box of EU policymaking. That's in part because of how the system is laid out, so that you don't always even know what your member state or what your government is defending at EU level. But on top of that, you also don't have, for instance, any central obligation for lobby transparency. So we cannot trace easily who's lobbying the capitals or the permanent representations, and who's having influence there. That's combined with the fact that you have to effectively lobby the council, you have to lobby 27 different capitals with very different cultural or even language settings. It really creates a situation where those that have the most money are allowed to have most access, because they're the ones that can really try and do national level lobbying at the same time as you can do European level lobbying, hire a lot of consultants and intermediaries that can help you, so on and so forth. So we don't have a very clear vision of what's happening towards the council. What we do know is that it is being lobbied. We have a few traces from a few countries where we can see that it's being lobbied. Here on the screen, you'll be seeing a result of a freedom of information request I placed for Estonia, where basically we got access to the lobby meetings that the Ministry of Justice had. And when defining the Digital Markets Act position of the country. And we saw that they'd had 7 meetings, and out of those 7 meetings, only 1 had been with not a GAFAM company, so not Google, Facebook, or Apple, Amazon. Not only that, as Apple seems to have quite good connections. 3 different meetings that they scored, one of them with the minister, so that's quite lucky for Apple. But beyond this sort of direct lobbying, apologies, second, I opened the wrong window. Direct lobbying of the companies themselves, going to meet policymakers, either the Parliament, Commission, or Council. They also rely quite heavily in financing a whole host of third parties. So those first parties can be, for instance, think tanks, sometimes it's NGOs. It can also be, for instance, SME associations or startup associations. And here on the screen, you'll be seeing a list of think tanks, especially, that have links to GAFAM companies. And this is quite, I think, an important part of the strategy of GAFAM, because you'll see, first of all, that the big companies rely quite heavily on having these links. And it's quite helpful for them in a variety of ways, whether it is to shape the public discussion by, you finance certain parts of the discussion, you don't finance other parts of the discussion. It could also be that sometimes these think tanks actually just set up lobbying opportunities for them. They'll set up a debate, they'll invite a policymaker, and then you as a sponsor attend that debate. And then you have some other components or other actors in this sort of universe. They're actually a little bit less, it's less clear whether they really are acting as a think tank or if they really are acting as a corporate representative. But I think that we can expand on that a little bit more during the Q&A. Here I'm showing you a leak that came out a little bit before the presentation of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, that basically showed it. So this is a leaked strategy from Google. It was the strategy that the company had laid out to influence the making of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And this is interesting because it basically confirms what we were thinking was happening. It confirms that the company relies on lobbying directly policymakers at different levels, so Commission, Parliament, and member state level, whilst relying on a network of third parties that, as the company itself says, are basically echoing its own message. This is all done to reframe the discussion around not the impact that the company or its platform or its anti-competitive activity has, but really reframe it on the negative impact that regulation could have. And this kind of brings me a little bit to a reframing or a shift in the lobbying strategy that we've seen from the big tech companies in the last few years, and especially as more and more scandals have appeared that have put the really, really big companies in a negative light. Think about Cambridge Analytica, think about all the lawsuits that are against the companies on anti-competitive behavior. The companies had to basically abandon this idea, this sort of old school Silicon Valley, almost libertarian idea that we just don't want and won't accept any regulation. We can regulate the area better than any regulators can. They've had to drop that, and they've replaced it to a much more nuanced public message where they're saying, actually, no, we really want regulation. It's just the regulation that we want. It's mostly voluntary, it's mostly self-regulation. It's mostly based on this sort of self-assessments, risk assessments. And ultimately, like this, they avoid looking like they are an obstacle to rules and to the protection of public interest, whilst also remaining in control of the solution and really ensuring that there's nothing that ultimately affects their business model. And here I'll end very briefly with a quote from Amazon in an internal document seen by Politico EU, where they were basically boasting of the success that their lobbying had in discussions on e-privacy directive. And to me, this is the e-privacy directive is quite a good example of why we should care about big tech lobbying. So in spite of the fact that, at EU level, there's a lot of policy proposals to tame big tech, rein in big tech, tackle this part of the business model, that part of the business model, there's always a risk that the intense lobbying power and very big lobbying budgets of the big tech companies and other parts and other components of the tech sector can distort policy making and can actually either delay or weaken proposals that are set out to defend the public interest. Hope I didn't go too much over time. And if you have any questions, we can probably continue with the Q&A.
Perfect. I think there are no questions in the chat right now, so I think for now I would just move on with the presentations and then maybe head into the Q&A after all of it, if that's fine. I think next up would be Andreas then.
Yeah, so leading on from what Margarida said, obviously about lobbying doesn't just happen without a reason. The millions of euros that go into the EU institutions from big tech companies is in order to get some sort of return. And what this has done is position these companies at the front of the queue for when digital solutions are required from these institutions. So when COVID came about 18 months ago, the tech companies that had lobbied the hardest in the previous years were on hand to act as the saviors almost to European nations that were scrambling for ways to deal with the virus. But of course, this came at a cost in regards to privacy rights and the attitude towards surveillance. So not only did we see big tech companies and founders benefit in the short term, as we saw the wealth of the likes of Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and so on increase by the billions, but it goes beyond just short-term profit. It was rather a structural overhaul that anoints big tech to unprecedented levels of power permanently as society enters a digitally dependent age. And so rather than nation states or the EU dictating to tech companies what their limitations were, it's now the other way around. So it represents the real power shift for big tech. The European Union has been the toughest market to crack traditionally in this aspect for tech companies, yet since the COVID-19 outbreak, big tech companies have managed to gain swaths of data that were previously off limits. So an early snapshot of this was how Google and Apple, who are the global duopoly of mobile phone operating systems, in the development of EU contact tracing app efforts, they were the ones dictating to governments the privacy levels that they should adhere to, rather than the other way around. As a result of this shift, big tech companies were able to turn COVID-19 into a real opportunity, and with this newfound power, battering down all the previous hurdles that stood in the way of invasive forms of technology that had potential for mass surveillance. It's led to the gradual erosion between the physical and digital realms. I mean, some of the key factors in this shift that I'd just like to touch on, in particular, for example, 5G was a subject of much debate prior to the pandemic in regards to privacy and what envisioned smart cities would do in terms of controlling just about every aspect of one's life, and therefore the potential for abuse from governments and tech companies was a real concern. But this debate ceased amid the virus, and when we came out of the first lockdowns and the subsequent stricter measures, we'd found that the infrastructure had already been implemented during this time, and there was no chance for resistance against this, no healthy discussion, no ability to protest. And so just a month after the virus hit Europe, Digital Europe, a trade organization which represents some of the biggest tech companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, sent a letter to the presidents of the 3 EU institutions calling for more public funds towards the digitalization of various sectors, including the deployment of 5G networks and fast tracking the creation of a European health data space to allow the sharing of data between public and private entities, and boosting investment in AI for the health sector. And that takes me to another key pillar that has kind of been eroded amid this virus by big tech and its and this newfound power that is obtained is access to data, but particularly health. This was seen as another almost uncrossable line prior to COVID-19, where the vast majority of citizens rightly had their concerns about the possibility of access from state actors, tech companies, and how this would be stored, the risk of it being shared with third parties and for commercial means and so on. But we saw how this quickly changed within months. Again, in the UK, for example, Amazon and Microsoft were involved in creating the interactive coronavirus dashboard for the British NHS, which overlooked serious privacy concerns, and other similar deals across Europe became commonplace, where individual health data of citizens fell vulnerable to these tech giants. And of course, the risks do not exclusively come just through the health apps themselves, but the fact that they allow for interaction with a broader range of other apps, and where these companies and governments have access to data that they never had before, and that discussion has kind of fallen amid the climate of fear that surrounds us today. Google and Apple, on which these apps run and are in control of the API updates, stated that they would allow them to enable interaction with a broader ecosystem of apps and government health authorities. And then finally, among the main concerns and what this has led us to is, in terms of surveillance implemented on the back of COVID-19, in my opinion, is which merges the 2 points I mentioned just now is digital identity, and this is an aspect that's been pushed for years in advance, but there was never really a way to for citizens to accept it. But now we've seen how again it's been pushed so simply in the last 18 months as a way of combating the virus, but some of the security, privacy, surveillance concerns have been overlooked. They're being pushed as the only way to return to normal amid COVID-19, but opens the door to unprecedented central surveillance system and an end to personal autonomy. And again, this wasn't a new idea, but it's one that, and it's also one that would have faced serious backlash outside of the circumstances we're in. But it's defended often that these are just temporary measures that will be in place until the end of this crisis, or until this crisis subsides somewhat. But as we've seen throughout the course of this virus, is that it doesn't tend to be the way. It was defended at the time that contact tracing apps would be voluntary, but we've seen how they've morphed into a far wider reaching surveillance tool in the form of health apps that prevent people from some of the most fundamental freedoms, prohibiting people from working and traveling, and it's based on a choice that's not one exclusively regarding health, but in terms of personal autonomy in this increasingly digital world. And so when big tech's interests align with those of governments, it makes for a troubling combination, because we've seen how governments have exploited this to their own advantage in order to quash certain fundamental human rights, like peaceful assembly. In various European countries, it's been lost. Journalistic freedom has been severely limited, and in cases punishable by law. And by making it permissible to impose such levels of surveillance under the guise of one crisis, it opens the door for any kind of crisis to be exploited for further control, because the mechanisms for this to happen have become more and more centralized and in the hands of tech companies, who we have seen how what levels of power they've risen to in order to put this into practice. And one of the most powerful mechanisms, of course, is the information stream. It certainly wasn't just that the response to COVID-19 happened by chance to benefit big tech companies, but that these companies and the key figures within them played a leading role in pushing the narrative into a direction that benefited them and their companies. So when Google, for example, accounts for almost 90% of global searches and can perform algorithmic manipulation that directs people into the way of information that's beneficial to them, or when Facebook, which hosts almost half of the world's population, can selectively censor on subjective grounds, it leaves true freedom of expression in a dangerous place. And the fact that media outlets now are more dependent than ever on digital ad revenue, and therefore Google and Facebook, who account for over 50% of the digital ad market, they become increasingly less likely to be scrutinized over their practices and their intentions. So we have an ever more controlled and conformed information stream, and which allows this fear mechanism and the stringent technological measures that come with it to be activated almost like with the flick of a switch in future situations. And so with this power grab that's been accentuated, that's increased amid this virus, manufacturing consent for further surveillance and control could become like child's play if not appropriately regulated.
Thank you, Andreas. And I think that's a perfect transition then with mention of Facebook and so on and the media to Alex start, and then we'll open up for discussion. So anyone who would like to, you can already post your questions in the chat or then join us in the discussion round in just a bit. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I will just add to what the previous speakers have already brilliantly outlined. My point that I want to make is that lobbying doesn't just happen in direct contact with EU institutions. Big tech's money and influence filter into the policy process through different routes. A lot of funding goes to trade associations, think tanks, even NGOs, as Margarida has already mentioned. I think few people outside of our little bubble in Brussels can imagine what a wide net of organizations is funded by big tech. If you take only the example of Google, in the US, Google publishes this list of organizations that they are members of or give donations to, and it includes no less than 94 trade associations, everything from the American Association of Advertising Agencies to the World Business Association. It also lists 256 third-party organizations that includes NGOs such as the Committee to Protect Journalists or think tanks such as the Tech Policy Institute. In Germany, Google was also forced to reveal a list of organizations it funds, and it's a member to at least 18 organizations in Germany alone. A particularly interesting form of influence gathering, and this is how these 2 points connect, is academic research and scholarship. Just to give you a few examples of what I'm saying here. Facebook funds the Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence, which is a new institute founded at the Technical University in Munich. And I think the initial funding alone was €6 million. Google also gives £1.3 million a year to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford to fund the annual digital news report. And Google money also helped to fund the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin, which does research on issues such as algorithmic transparency. These are 3 high-profile examples, but I'm quite certain there are many, many more out there. A couple of years ago, I tried to systematically gather data from German universities on funding by big tech companies, but most of my requests were refused. So I think there's a big black hole there in terms of how much academic funding is around there from big tech companies in Europe. We simply have no data and very little research is being done on this issue at all. So why does this matter if Google funds research institutions, academia, think tanks, and so like? Google is meant to mean big tech. So I think the point I'm gearing up to is that studies and research funded by big tech has a huge impact on the policy process. To name one very prominent example, in late October 2020, we were just weeks away from the Commission presenting its draft for the Digital Services Act package, the law that Margarida mentioned earlier. And just crucially, weeks before this draft proposal was published, a think tank called CIPE published a study, which was funded by Google, on the economic costs of regulation. And the Reuters news agency published a story later on about that report with the headline, "Economic cost of new EU tech rules could top €100 billion, study says." So this Reuters report was published and reproduced in newspapers across Europe. So there you can already gauge how massive the impact is of research funded by big tech. It influences the public debate. It influences the way we discuss these laws in the policy bubble in Brussels. And yeah, it's not just academia, it's not just research. Google and Facebook and other companies are also lobbying the fourth estate, journalism. Last year, my colleague Ingo Dachwitz and me published a study called Google the Media Patron. It highlights that Google has funded European publishing houses with hundreds of millions of euro over the past years. This funding is part of the Google News initiative. The bulk of the money, as we found out, went to old established media companies around Europe who used it for innovation funding. So things like data journalism, new paywalls, new VR products, all this kind of fancy new innovation in journalism. If you're a journalist, I recommend that you go and check out if your own media organization has received funding from Google. There is a chance it has. Google also offers trainings for journalists, custom-made products. It funds things like industry conferences, some of the biggest journalism events in Europe, funded by Google and or Facebook. Since Google has started this, Facebook has started its own program, the Facebook Journalism Project. We believe that this money that is being siphoned into journalism by big tech is meant to appease publishers who are concerned about Google's and Facebook's dominance on the digital advertising market. Google and Facebook are kind of eating into the advertising revenue that publishers are making online, and this is a way of kind of lobbying and cultural influence in the journalism sector. I can say a bit more about this later, but the key point here is Google and to a lesser degree Facebook have become both major patrons of and major business partners of publishing media. So today it's very hard to avoid Google when you're seeking to distribute, produce, or monetize news content. At the same time, Google has influenced the way journalism thinks about innovation, the way journalism thinks as an industry, as a trade, as a profession thinks about itself, and has had a pervasive cultural influence on journalism. And this, I would argue, is also a form of lobbying that we should, take into account when thinking about the wider picture of what lobbying means. And I think I can say a bit more also about how it is to report on big tech companies in Brussels. I think it's a very kind of interesting, in a way of what is the level of engagement? How much do we actually interact with big tech companies as journalists? Is there facts we're able to find other than from reports and aggregated data? But I think that I will leave that to the discussion later on, and we'll close with this remark right here.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you also, Margarida and Andreas. And there's actually already a question. I think I would just go with it right now and direct it to you, Alexander, but obviously Andreas and Margarida, feel free to join in. Karl Gustaf is asking if there's any example of media that have tried to break free from this platform power. And he mentions besides examples from for example, is there any way, or do you have examples on whether there are alternatives to break free from that platform power as a media outlet, or how do you see that, Alexander?
I mean, it's very hard. Just a reminder, Google is in most European media organizations that we talk to one of the main providers of traffic. So a lot of people are just directed to news websites from Google search and other Google outlets. For some media, it's up to a quarter of their traffic. And traffic in the digital world also means advertising revenue, because the more eyeballs you have on your website, the more money you receive from ads. Google is also an intermediator in the digital ad space. So when you see ads served on a news website you visit, more often than not, those are directed by Google's ad service, where they are auctioned off in real-time bidding. So Google is also an important intermediator in making money from ads. Google is also offering more and more tools for publishing, stuff like Google Analytics. They produce a CMS, content management system for publishing companies. A lot of newsrooms I know use Gmail, Google Drive, all these co-working tools that Google offers. And so it's very hard to flee from that ecosystem. I would say probably not a lot of newsrooms have really tried, because there's not a lot of conscience around that being a problem. So I think I've talked at a few journalism conferences about how Google is, has this pervasive influence in the publishing sphere, and a lot of journalists ask me, like, why is that even a big deal? I mean, they're not trying to influence editorial decisions, and that is also something that we have found, and we couldn't find any instance of Google trying to influence the actual content of news. But I think the wider point is that they are curtailing the autonomy on the business side of media, and I think that is at least as problematic. And I think we have also made the argument that all the money they're shoving into the news business has disproportionately benefited the largest media organizations in Europe. So it's also Google and Facebook's influence has also been largely harmful to media pluralism in Europe. But it's, I think it's hard to break free, and I think nobody has really tried.
Maybe one question adding to that, you mentioned that they actually, don't see the need to break free, or say it's not editorial processes. I think, Margarida, in your study with Corporate Europe Observatory, also asked you, Commission officials or staff members, how they see the influence of big tech in the EU Commission or other European institutions. And I mean, they are not oblivious to the fact that they are being lobbied, I would assume. What did they tell you? How do they see this issue? And are there any intentions of changing the lobby influence from their side?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think it's different depending on the department and even sometimes on the official that you speak to. There's certainly some people that we talk to and that will tell us straight up, we agree that this is an issue, that there's too much lobby, that there's too much lobbying pressure. Obviously, no one thinks that they're ever influenced. I think that this is one point. So they'll always say yes, but we can handle it, or we'll seek out other voices. And I will say that just figuring out and identifying the lobbying as a problem is already a good step. That's already putting these officials in a very good position compared to others. But what I hear from them quite often as well is that even with the best of intentions, often they are themselves not able to identify every single part or component of the lobbying, especially when we entered into the area of the third parties. So the officials are it's quite easy for them to know that Google is saying something because Google is trying to get something. But when the think tank comes that doesn't disclose that Google is a funder, and is all of a sudden talking about the economic impact of a policy, then that makes it harder for them. If you have an academic, that's even worse. And you have to think, you have officials, you have also policymakers. Not everyone is actually able to read and understand or spend a lot of time trying to figure out the actual research and academic basis of the argument. So quite often they'll just take anything as one point and counterpoint, counterpoint. They're not really engaging with the basis of the argument. So that can make it really, really hard for them. That being said, this is probably the most progressive and more concerned parts of the policymaking process. There are other parts of the institutions that will just say, and they'll sometimes point out, that some of these lobbyists are their former friends. The revolving door does exist in Brussels, and it's quite alive and in the tech sector. And they'll say that they're friends, that they are in the same social circle. There's really no big deal in what they're doing. They're just representing the interests of their company. So you have differences in the officials as well.
One question I would have there is, how do you all see them? Because Andreas had mentioned that it's a really difficult or really dangerous combination of having big tech interests aligned with government, basically both going hand in hand. What is happening there right now, for example, with the EU Parliament proposing a resolution to ban all kinds of biometric surveillance systems, also predictive policing and so on. And a lot of member states in the EU actually know the AI Act is already tough enough. We should even include less technology into the definition of AI, and kind of trying to water down this, regulating those technologies. I know you focused more on the DSA and MA, but also maybe as a question to Andreas, and then Alexander and you, Margarida, could join in. Why are governments, or why are politicians, even if they are aware of being lobbied, and even if they are maybe also aware of the consequences to civil society through those technologies, is there such a strong interest in promoting those systems and implementing those systems nonetheless, and actually going hand in hand with big tech on those things?
Yeah,
I would maybe, Margarida or Andreas, whoever wants to.
Yeah, I can just do a quick comment. I mean, I think that the AI Act is a great example of the dynamic that we have between the different EU institutions, where you have the European Parliament, which is, even though we have issues there as well with lobby transparency, it's still the most transparent of the institutions. It's also the one that is closest to civil society, that is more scrutinized, I think, as well by media, and that often means that it actually takes a more public interest approach. It's not always, this is not guaranteed, obviously, but it does often take a more public interest approach. It tries to improve and strengthen positions. Whilst on the other hand, you have the council, which is incredibly secretive and distant from citizens. So quite often corporate power takes hold there. I think that the AI Act and the issue of facial recognition and biometric surveillance, it just kind of picks up on so many of the things that will improve or strengthen an argument from a corporate representative, because it touches, and it has, a company can basically appeal to the security interests of a country, and you do have some countries that are, already, due to their own politics and years of securitization, they're very interested in this on their own right. So they're very happy to partner up with the companies in this. And then they'll also be doing the economic impact argument. This is also very common, I think, in the AI Act. Basically meaning that if you do regulate, you're going to lose millions in your economy. And this is a horrible decision for you. And the AI Act, you also hear a lot the geopolitical argument, I think, meaning that if you regulate AI in Europe, China and the US are not going to regulate. So you're going to lose this sort of like technological arms race that is happening all over the world. And I think that those sort of arguments take hold in some member states, and that's probably why you're seeing that dynamic there.
Thank you, Margarida. Andreas, I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it seems to be that there is some kind of balance of the debate, but when it comes to actual practice, it becomes very different due to such vast corporate interest. The big selling point is so often about security, pre-virus, and in the current situation, whether it's geopolitical or in regards to personal safety, and those selling points tend to win. And another thing we find is that there seems to be symbolic discussion of some of the biggest concerns, but in practice, it always leaves the door open for regulation that's in favor of tech companies and governments who want to impose a more stringent form of surveillance. So it's like still pushing these forms of surveillance along, but kind of sugarcoating them with some symbolic gestures of protection. But over the course of time, you see that we still end up with more control and more control over us and more power in the hands of tech companies and governments over the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. I think before I give the microphone to Alexander, I just shortly wanted to ask Karl Gustaf, who has joined us, as I see on the panel with the video. I just wanted to ask him, did you have a question on the matter to our panelists, or was it maybe by accident that you joined with the video? I just want to make you aware of it either way. Because I think you also joined with the listen only option, so we can't hear you. So if you want to unmute yourself, you would need to rejoin the room and choose the mic option. But you're on video, which if you like, you can turn off or not. I just wanted to let you know. I think that's the answer. Then I hand over to Alexander.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point, which I think very important. I mean, we have to remember that the European Union as a system was set up in a way that it would seek, the European Union institutions seek political legitimacy by including all stakeholders in the policy process. So as opposed to other political systems we see in various European member states, the European Union institutions will always try to, get as much input from lobbyists as possible to be able to say later on, oh, before we made this law, we included everyone who's important to that discussion, the companies, the NGOs, the civil society actors. However, in practice, of course, that discussion is always skewed towards the companies because they have a lot more resources to do that lobbying. And in the end, the American tech companies have realized that there is a hack into the European Union institutions, namely by always trying to include as many stakeholders as possible. The tech companies realize that if they fund as many stakeholder organizations as possible, they will, always be heard not as the single voice that they are, the single unitarian interest, but they will be perceived as a kind of choir where you hear not just Google and Facebook, but you suddenly hear all these different member organizations, and then you hear some of the think tanks, even some of the NGOs who are funded by Google, who share a certain policy outlook, and that will become a sort of symphony where the European policymakers are fooled into thinking that represents a wider interest than just the narrow sectional interest of 4 or 5 companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a question in the chat from Alexandra Pardell, who's asking whether you could find out in your research which are the most vulnerable member states in the EU to big tech lobbying. Are there any states that are more affected or more easygoing for big tech in a way or in any sense than?
Yes, I will start by saying that these fluctuate. A lot of these dynamics fluctuate. So we've seen countries in the past take a position or even be influenced by lobbying of specific companies and that change it in a different policy proposal. That being said, I think you can probably guess who the usual suspects are of a pro-tech and especially pro-big tech approach in the council, and that's really Ireland. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that there's an interest, for Ireland to sort of protect the big tech interests. We often also see Luxembourg. It's also not an accident. Amazon's headquarters are there. And then you have, beyond these, you have a sort of like more fluid dynamic where it will depend a little bit on the issue. It also depends on how it relates to other industries. So a little bit like what Alexander was saying, the companies are successful when they bring other stakeholders, but they're also successful when they try to get other companies, and especially maybe nationally relevant companies to their side and to do their their business. But from that sort of like more flexible position, I would probably name the Sweden, Estonia from the sort of like very pro-tech, pro-innovation perspective. Poland, Czech Republic also kind of come up. Germany is an interesting one because Germany sometimes can be pro-tech, sometimes can be anti-tech or anti-big tech Silicon Valley companies. So it does change. I think Ireland and Luxembourg are the ones that I would probably always, if you had me betting, I'll probably bet on them.
And from maybe the possibility, Andreas, have you had any countries that are more affected negatively by this, for example, rollout of surveillance technology now, or generally big tech lobbying?
It's interesting because the aspect of lobbying correlates with investments from tech companies, not just lobbying, I mean actual investments. And the names that Margarida mentioned are in line with that. It's so investment buys leniency, because the countries that are responsible for reporting data breaches and other privacy-related issues to the European institutions are the companies that the countries that host these companies. But when they become of such economic importance, we see that they're reluctant to do so. And so in terms of the list of the 10 European countries with the most big tech data center investments, it's Ireland first, it's Sweden second, and Germany third. But in recent years, in the last couple of years, so Microsoft, for example, have invested $1.5 billion in Italy, $1.5 billion in Poland, and this is a form of, in my eyes, like buying leniency. It makes these countries far less likely to really scrutinize them, report any violations they might have committed, because they're of such importance to their economies. So it's kind of another form of lobbying, but more in terms of direct investments. And I think as countries become more and more dependent on tech companies, it leaves this scrutiny even more at risk.
Thank you, Andreas. I see Jose has joined us. I would just hand over to you if you have a question for the panelists.
I think Jose's on the next panel. Jose, your camera is on. And you're muted.
Okay. Always nice, always joining us today up there. For me, one question there, talking about this influence then, and I mean, you've described it earlier, all three of you, this web, and the obscurity of who's funding who, and politicians maybe also not knowing anymore what is big tech funded, what is not. I think in the CEO report, you also speak of that big tech companies try to elude the bigger picture by really just pointing to very specific issues and technical issues. And then you also earlier mentioned, Margarida, that strategy to be like, yeah, of course we're regulation, but in this and that way, so it suits us. And it's a question to all of you, basically, because you've pointed out so many issues, and you've pointed out also some of the funding ties and of influence. Where should journalists then actually look to not get distracted by by some smoke and mirror through the big tech companies, or not get distracted by different narratives they use, like Europe against China and the US and things like that? So what would, in your all opinion, be the bigger picture to focus on as journalists, and also maybe in the context that Alexander presented with journalists themselves? being within this ecosystem of Google or within the ecosystem of big tech. Yeah, what do we need to focus on to not get distracted, and how to do so, basically? Whoever feels like maybe going first.
I mean, I can't summarize like the whole. It's such a complex, wide-ranging issue, but it's just offer like my 2 cents would be to try and like diversify one's sources as vastly as possible in terms of searches now. Like, I know it's so simple and so common, just any question or any kind of research someone wants to do, it's just a quick Google search, but there's so much more behind that. And there's other ways that people can do their research, other search engines, other resources that you can check. Now, thankfully, at least particularly in Europe, it's quite transparent on who's funding who, and you can often see that in the vast majority of cases, whether it's like, for example, media-related sources, fact checkers, or and other resources, you can see funded by Google, funded by Facebook, funded by another tech company. So the more independent the source can be, the better, and the tools with which we search as well, we can do a better job of making sure that they're as independent as possible. Like I said, it's a complex topic. That's just my basic start.
I would add to that. I think that I would very much agree with what Andreas is saying here. I would add to that I think it is very often important to look behind and blast some of the grand narratives. Margarida mentioned one of the where the tech companies say, "Oh, we are there for SMEs," and some of these grand narratives build on ideas that don't bear up to the facts. So I would encourage people to look at the actual texts of laws proposed, look at the nitty-gritty of lawmaking. Very often you find things that don't fit into the grand narrative at all. I'd encourage to be specific about when writing about regulation, because very often that's a lot more interesting than following some previously outlined grand narrative storyline.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is great advice. I guess what I would say, and from the perspective of us as a lobby watchdog, is and sometimes speaking to people that are just getting into this area of research, what I would say is that basically the way that we are seeing corporate power from the tech sector happen is pretty much the same way that we've seen corporate power happen in other big industrial sectors. The way that big tech works is the same way that big pharma worked, big agri worked, and big tobacco worked. So good journalism work will take place in the same way, and which is how Alexander and Andreas were saying. So in this sense, you can just apply, I think, the same basics of research to it. Added to this, I will say that, and especially on EU policy making, the first thing is, of course, always follow the money. And this is something that we spend a lot of time doing, trying to trace who's funding who, who's member of what organization, and then exposing that and really trying to make that very clear. And then when it comes to the lobbying positions, I would always try to question or try to figure out what's actually the business model, what's the profit angle, and what are the companies trying to get out of this or not get out of this? Are they actually becoming selfless actors? Yeah, but it ultimately, the same skills and the same rituals that you had before, you can apply to this. It's just that now you kind of have to understand just a new sector and probably one or two different new tools, but the basics are the same.
Great, thank you all so much. I mean, I think we could spend a lot more time on this, and we've barely covered, I think, the issue of being in the web of influence. Like, there's so much more to it. But with a look at the time, I guess there's not much time left to do so. I would just ask, is there anything from your side, because I think there's no question right now. Is there anything you would, as a final remark, want to stress to the audience and that you haven't gotten around to saying, or are you good as it stands right now?
Yeah, it almost feels bad to add anything to this, because I thought that the last round was quite interesting. I will just say that, of course, big tech in itself is quite interesting. The big 5 companies, really, if we look at them, but to I think anyone researching the area should also take into consideration that these are just a few of the companies. They're the ones with the biggest budgets, but that there's really a universe of other companies. European companies sometimes have a better they don't have so many reputational issues and will have an easier time getting to their governments, for instance. And yeah, the way that the big companies are acting is sometimes reproduced at smaller scales in other sectors. And it'd be interesting to see how this then affects, pharmaceutical industry, insurance industry, defense, migration. I mean, digitalization really does impact kind of everything in our lives today. So it's also, we cannot, whilst we want and should hold big tech accountable, we cannot lose sight that there's still other actors out there that also need scrutiny.
I would agree, and I think what Andreas mentioned earlier with the scramble to get their hands on health data by a lot of companies out there, that's a typical example of where something that isn't even publicly discussed much yet is already so much on the agenda of corporations who have a profit interest. I would suggest that sometimes the lobbying about something starts 5 or 10 years earlier than it is actually ever hits the headlines in a big way. So let's look about what kind of these behind doors conversations are about, and then maybe there's a lot more to think and work on that about.
Absolutely, yeah. Trying to kind of anticipate this rather than reporting when it may be already too late. Yeah, Andreas, I don't want to cut you off. Any final remarks from your side?
No, I mean, I can't say really anything more than what Alexander and Margarida said, that we always have to be, both as citizens and journalists and anyone really, is just to be aware of the bigger picture, and it takes a healthy degree of cynicism, but I think it's a time where we can see why that's valid, and to see that it's beyond just, it's beyond a search engine, or it's beyond a social network. These are behemoths that are dictating just about, or influencing just about every aspect of our lives, and we see that direction's only moving further and further and expanding. So yeah, this is what I would finish with.
No, really important topic. As I said before, unfortunately we didn't get to everything, and I hope that we may have the chance to discuss this again at another occasion. For now, I think I have to thank you all, the audience, for being here today, this morning, and the 3 of you for sharing your insights and your expertise on the matter with us.